on our GoToWebinar can also hear the question. So up next, I'd like to invite Abby Young to speak on the Regional Climate Protection Strategy for the SF Bay Area. And we got the state lens, now we're going to get the Bay Area regional lens.
Great. Thanks. So I'm going to turn this lights off. I'm just thinking I might see the slides better. That might be a little bit, oh good, and I can, is that already on? Oh, look at that. Okay, great. Can everyone see? And well, your papers and everything? Okay. Well, thank you for having me here this morning. I'm Abby Young. I'm the manager of our climate protection program at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Been there for about 9 years, and prior to that I was at ICLEI for 11 years, working with local governments to develop climate action plans. So I've kind of been doing this for a long time. I wanted to just say one thing before I get into it, and that's that this is real, even though the Air District has had a climate protection program for about 10 years, doing a regional climate protection plan, climate protection strategy, is a very, very new thing for us. So we're kind of in the throes of it right now, and what I wanted to do with this presentation was kind of paint a bit of a picture as to why the Air District is moving in this direction, and tell you a bit about what we're trying to achieve in our process, and then drill down a little bit and really talk about buildings and energy. So let me do that. So back in November of 2013, our board of directors adopted a climate protection resolution. And it basically established for the Air District the same long-term greenhouse gas reduction goal that we've got at the state level, to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And that was for the whole region. And in order to help the region get on a pathway toward that target or goal, the board of directors directed staff to develop a regional climate protection strategy. So we kind of acknowledge, though, that the Air District does not have all-encompassing power over everything in the Bay Area. So it's going to be, really what we're doing is we're trying to focus in on, well, what's the value added that the Air District brings, and how can we best use that to help facilitate meeting this goal. Oh yes, I did all sorts of little animation things. So, and one of the things is kind of pulling us there is we always try to look at what the state is doing. We want to complement statewide efforts. We, of course, work very closely with the Air Resources Board. So, you know, we've got these state-level targets. We've got AB 32. SB 32 is somewhere circulating and percolating in Sacramento. And we've also got a lot of regional efforts to address greenhouse gas emissions through Plan Bay Area. BCDC is adapting to rising tides, tries to get us to be more resilient in the face of climate change. BayREN, of course, looking at energy. So there's a lot of regional efforts as well as what's going on at the state level. And there are a lot of local efforts. So can you raise your hand if you're in a local government or, you know, city or county or town that has an adopted climate action plan? Has. Okay, that's pretty good. There's about 60, to the best of our knowledge, adopted local climate action plans in the Bay Area. And that is the most of any metropolitan region in the United States. So we have this planning landscape, if you will, from the state all the way down to teeny-weeny little towns in the Bay Area that are doing this long-term climate action planning. So it really makes sense for the Air District to try to do this as well. And for us, of course, there's a very close connection to air quality. We are ultimately, and in our bones, a public health agency. And the way we protect public health is through making sure that we have clean air and we meet state and federal clean air standards. And we have incorporated into that vision, you know, the health of the global climate as well, because of all the related air quality impacts that climate change brings. So every, technically, what is it, 3 years? I don't know. Do you know, Sigal, how many times, how often we have to update that ozone plan? We don't quite do it on time. So our last one was, I think, a 2010 ozone update. But what we did was, instead of looking at ozone, which we're required to develop a regional plan to address ozone, instead of looking just at ozone and at the actions and policies and rules we can adopt to address ozone, back in 2010 we thought, well, it doesn't make sense to look at each type of air pollutant in a vacuum. Let's do a multi-pollutant approach. So in 2010, we developed a multi-pollutant clean air plan for the region that looked at ozone precursors, particulate matter, local toxic air contaminants, and greenhouse gases. We just started getting our toe in the door in terms of greenhouse gases, but this year, now we're doing an update to the 2010 Clean Air Plan. It's the 2016 Clean Air Plan, and it's still a multi-pollutant approach, but one huge part of it is a climate strategy. So we're actually calling it the 2016 Clean Air Plan / Regional Climate Protection Strategy. We're very good at coming up with document names. So it's not necessarily designed to document how we will meet that 2050 target, but it's basically taking everything the Air District has and throwing it at greenhouse gases. And so let me talk a bit about how we're going to do that. So again, in trying to be consistent and complementary to what is happening at the state level, we're looking at what ARB did with the 2014 update to the AB 32 scoping plan. And ARB took a sectoral approach. So they looked at different economic sectors and thought, well, what are all the things we need to do in these economic sectors to address greenhouse gases? And we thought that that actually made a lot of sense. That's a huge departure for the Air District. We usually look at stationary sources and mobile sources, and there's all this Air District, rigid nomenclature. So this was new for us. So these are the 9 sectors that ARB looked at and that we are looking at in our climate protection strategy. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to focus in on buildings and energy. But first, I wanted to let you take a look at what our Bay Area greenhouse gas portfolio looks like. So the big pie chart breaks down greenhouse gases more or less into those 9 sectors. Now you're going to say, but wait, Abby, there's only 7 listed there. How can this be? And that's because some of these overlap so much. As Peter mentioned, there's a lot of energy related to the water sector. So really that water sector you don't see here, it's embedded in the energy, in the electricity use. So there's a little bit of overlap that doesn't really show up here. But you can see that huge portions of this inventory are taken up by transportation, no surprise, about 39, 38%, similar to some of your climate action plans. And that's broken out down here. You can see most of it is passenger cars and light-duty trucks, and then the next biggest portion is heavy-duty trucks. As we move toward 2030, that ratio is going to change. It's going to be a lot more heavy-duty trucks and less emissions, fewer emissions from light-duty vehicles, largely due to improving electrification of vehicles and improving fuel efficiency. And then the next biggest section is industry. The Air District has been hearing quite a lot over the last year and a half from stakeholder groups, members of the public, and board members on how we really need to look at greenhouse gas emissions coming from heavy industry, and in particular the 5 refineries that we regulate in the Bay Area. So a lot of those that's what you see in that industrial segment. Now, if we take those sectors and we look out toward 2050, how close do we get to that goal? So what you're seeing, the black dots, the first dot is where we are today. The second dot is where the Bay Area, where the AB 32 goal for 2020 is. That's a return to 1990 levels. The third dot is where the governor's 2030 target is. That's a 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. And then ultimately out here, I don't know if you guys can see it, there's a dot that shows 80% below 1990 levels, and that's where we need to be by 2050. Now what you're seeing happening with all these sectors is the impact of adopted and very likely adopted policies. So for example, cap and trade is in there out to 2020. Now we know that cap and trade will probably be expanded beyond 2020. We've made an assumption that it will be, but the cap won't be reduced. SB 350 policies are not in here because we have no idea what those are going to look like. So there may be a little more wiggle room, but the bottom line is that's a huge gap. That's a huge task that we have in front of us. So I'm going to speed up now. So what we did was we looked at each of these sectors and we did a sector-based analysis of what the current greenhouse gas levels are in that sector, what they're projected to be using that strip chart, and then we looked at, well, what are the federal, state, regional, and local policies that are already in place that have come in place that are affecting this sector, and where might there be policy gaps where the Air District has a bit of value and can step in. So this is kind of informing not only it's a quantitative analysis, but also a policy analysis. And then it informs the kinds of policies we'll include in that regional climate protection strategy. So we did this process for each of those sectors. So here are little cogs and wheels. So here, the regional climate protection strategy has some key objectives. And this is sort of the thought process we have as we choose what kinds of regulations or what kinds of activities are we going to pursue in this strategy. So first of all, what we want to do is we want to ultimately, it's kind of like the loading order that Peter talked about. We want to reduce demand. And that's not just demand for energy, but it's demand for transportation, demand for driving, which might be reflected as reduction in VNT, demand for consumption, which may be reflected as a reduction in the waste stream. So overall, a reduction in demand. That's where efficiency would come into play. Then we want to look at the electricity that we're using and try to continue on this path of decarbonization. But we also want to promote electrification. So some funny things are going to happen to electricity use. We're going to try to do as much efficiency as we can, but we're also going to try to convert fossil fuel-based end uses like driving or space and water heating over to electricity. So we may see electricity use spike a bit, but as long as we continue to decarbonize, we should be good. And then finally, we want to look at short-lived climate pollutants, these pollutants with the high GWPs like methane, fluorinated gases, and black carbon, and we want to reduce those. And then we also, because we're a clean air agency, there are non-GHG gases that we're trying to address in this clean air plan as well. And then how we're going to achieve these objectives is through the typical tools, traditional tools that the Air District has at its disposal. Regulation, working with local governments, grants and incentives, outreach, science and research, collaboration, all of these things. So let's look at buildings. So this is the pie chart that looks at building energy emissions for the Bay Area. And this is 2015. So as you can see, a lot of this is natural gas use. These are emissions, right? So we're trying to think about, well, how can we do some converting of electricity end uses over to natural gas, and how can we facilitate that? And then ultimately continue to decarbonize electricity. So these are a few things that we're thinking of in our clean air climate protection strategy, clean air plan and climate protection strategy. We want to work to increase energy efficiency in buildings, and this is where the work we do with local governments really comes into play. So and I'm furiously taking notes back there, trying to think how can we complement what BayREN is doing. And we've met with Jerry a couple of times and talked about how the Air District, again, can bring a value added to this. Are there ways that we can facilitate some of the model ordinance development? some of the best practice and networking and information sharing? Are there ways that we could use our regulatory authority? Now, Peter mentioned, the CEC in the state of California develop standards. Local governments have the ability to adopt local building codes. The Air District does not. We can't get involved in building codes. But we do regulate fireplaces. So, there are some little nooks and crannies that we might be able to get in, and we need to explore those. Decarbonizing building energy use. This might be a way that we could do it. Is there a way that we could use our regulatory authority to look at the discrete end uses, the sale of fossil fuel-based space and water heating equipment? So we're definitely going to be doing some legal research on our authority, and we're going to try to see what we can do and continue meeting with groups like this. So now when we talk about decarbonizing energy use, there again, this is not an area that the Air District typically sticks its nose into, but there are a lot of opportunities. We do regulate power plants and cogeneration facilities, and we can try to get them to be as energy efficient as possible, but that does not really move the needle. That's just fiddling at the margins. What we really need to do is decarbonize the energy supply. And one area that we've been thinking about getting more involved in is working with some of the community choice aggregation networks and possibly helping facilitate some of those activities. So that might be an opportunity for us. And that, actually, I kind of leapt ahead of myself. So again, these are, and expanding electrification, in fact, we have a big EV vehicle program. So when we look toward 2050, again, we're trying to use our traditional tools, but in new sectors and in new ways. So right now, we are at a point where we will be coming out with our draft plan in probably July. We just finished a round of public workshops in February and early March. We'll probably be doing another round in July when we have the draft plan out. We're about to launch a series of working groups on some of these sectors to get input on our draft control strategy. And we have a interactive website up called, what is it called? It's really hard to find too. But it's, I get it confused with our Spare the Air, My Air Online. Anyway, yeah. Yes, that's it. Thank you, Sigal. Clean Air Forum. And you can look at all the actual list of control measures and all the implementation actions we're proposing. And by the end of this week, we should have the actual text of the different measures, which ultimately is several hundred pages long, up as well. So I encourage you to take a look at that, and probably went too long, but I'm happy to take questions. No questions. If you think of something like, oh yeah.
Sorry. We've heard a lot of questions recently from our local government partners about fuel switching and just general interest in this, getting to reducing carbon, bringing it back and everything. We're also stuck a little bit in a tough spot in that Bayron's funded by ratepayer energy efficiency dollars. Fuel switching right now in energy efficiency is kind of sometimes a taboo subject. But I think, I'm curious, and I'd like to go to look at the plan online too, but kind of just comments from the Air District on whether fuel switching is something that you guys are looking to explore as well. Sounds like it, how we might be able to potentially partner with something.
Yeah, that's great. I got that question also from Don Weiss, who's the Executive Director of Marine Clean Energy, because same issue. They're doing a whole lot of stuff with their, with energy efficiency, but the, fuel switching, there's not a lot of funding for. So that's an area that we definitely want to get involved in. And one thing that we're thinking about is there a role for the Air District in trying to facilitate some of the PACE financing and uptake of PACE financing for some of those switch outs. So possibly Is there a way to cover transaction costs that might bring down the cost of doing those kinds of changes with PACE financing? So, I mean, we're again, new area for us, so we don't come to the table with a lot of solutions. We're trying to figure them out right now, but that's a big part of what we want to do, and an area that we're thinking of trying to flex, potentially exercise some regulatory authority if we can, which might take the shape of, in new construction, we've often done in new construction, your furnace a furnace has to meet a certain air quality, not greenhouse gas, but like air quality limit. And is there a way to do that for greenhouse gases?
Just a follow-up comment on that. I know you're aware of this, Abby, but just for the benefit of everyone else, the city of Palo Alto has also been doing a cost-effectiveness study about fuel switching for appliances in particular, because they have their own electric utility. They have a lot more flexibility there, and so that's something I think to kind of keep our eyes on as we're looking for the ability to promote that at a residential level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah.
Both you and Peter mentioned all of these different goals. There's the state energy commission's goals, given coming out of the state because executive orders amending, and every municipality, original climate action plan has their own goal, right? And they're not all exactly aligned and meshed. Is there a singular entity who is the keeper of the state greenhouse gas inventory and assures that there's not a lot of overlap in the boundaries, not a lot of double counting, and or that we could, in aggregate, roll up all the municipalities, right? So we got every city, right, to report their greenhouse gas emissions. We roll it up and then add those together, right? And that is the state. And then have the state, if there's something in a gap, right, it's missed by a city, the state picks that up, or there, some other entity picks it up. Is there a singular?
Peter, you can jump in if you want to. I would say there's a couple different answers to that question. So, I'm sorry. So the question was, is there a single state agency that really looks at all these different kinds of targets and climate action plans at the different levels of government and make sure there's no or where there's overlap or there isn't overlap, or if there are gaps, who can fill the gaps, and do they all roll up and add up to the sum of the state? In a greenhouse, right? Yeah, no. ARB conducts the state and owns the state's greenhouse gas inventory. We're the only, I think we're the only air district that does a regional greenhouse gas inventory. Our regional greenhouse gas inventory is going to be very different from, even if all the local governments in the Bay Area rolled their inventories up, it would be a very different number from what the Bay Area Air District has. We count things like air travel, offshore ship emissions, emissions from refineries. Our scope is different, and that's appropriate. Local governments, you treat regional emissions from regional transportation maybe a little bit differently. And I think it's okay that they don't all roll up, because ultimately what has to happen is every single jurisdiction, whether it's a town, city, county, air district, the state, has to do every single thing that we can do and more. And we're still going to fall short. Sorry. The way you know if you're getting there is through regular inventorying. And that's the way that you'll hopefully be able to see changes. Sigal?
I noticed one of the suggestions for local governments is to explore time of sale of energy assessments or updates. From what I've heard from Berkeley, who's done this in other cities, this is brought up the realtors right now and are really against it. And maybe this is a suggestion for Bay Red or the Air District, but it could be on a regional level to hold some sort of workshop or meeting to bring in these realtors and show, that this isn't an end-all and not going to affect them in the way they think, but maybe get, buy-in on a regional scale so that every city doesn't need to do it on their own.
Yeah, so the question is, there have been these RICO and SECO type ordinances, these for existing buildings, the time of sale ordinances that require either certain quantitative upgrades or performance, or even just assessments. And I think one thing that Peter mentioned is really important, that I think one reason that Berkeley switched from the prescriptive approach to more the assessment approach is because that overly prescriptive, mandating certain technologies doesn't necessarily get you to the performance that you want it to get you at. So the question is also what, realtors are always immediately really opposed to those kinds of policies because it changes the playing field, right? Creates an uneven playing field. And is there a way that the Air District or BayREN could convene some kind of regional meeting of realtors and talk about this issue and get them a little more on board? And can you tell, Sigal used to work at the Air District, because we talked about this and about how, well, if it's an uneven playing field, wouldn't it be great if maybe the Air District could do a regional RICO or SECO, and then it's an even playing field. But again, we get into this problem with Air Districts really not being able to do that. We don't have the authority over building codes. So we have invited the San Mateo County Realtor Group to one of our working groups on the buildings sector for, we're having a series of these meetings. So that might be a good question for us to pose to them if they think that would be helpful.
Another thing I noticed on your slide was one of those strategies, I forget which sector it was under, but you had a vote on consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory. Can you give us the 3-minute version of what that is and what you're doing?
I'll do shorter than 3 minutes. So the question was, one of the bullet points mentioned a consumption-based inventory. And the Air District did, working very closely, and that's kind of a euphemism for it, UC Berkeley did it. But we worked with Dan Kammen's group, the Cool Climate Network at UC Berkeley, and developed a consumption-based greenhouse gas inventory for the Bay Area. And that looks at the census block level, so it's pretty granular, and it looked at about over 400 different categories of goods and services, and did a life cycle, using, it's all modeling, but a life cycle analysis and attributed greenhouse gases to the average household level within a census block of the kind of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in all these different goods and services. And we have that up on our website with some GIS mapping so that you can look all over the Bay Area and pick neighborhoods and see how do we come out according to different things. It created just this huge argument in my family about whose neighborhood was the greenest. So that was a big Thanksgiving discussion. But there were some really interesting takeaways, and some of them were that in the Bay Area, one of the things that we're good. We're lower than the national average in a lot of things. We have a cooler climate, more moderate climate. Hydroelectricity, energy goes into a lot of our electricity. So a lot of our, we're a lot lower in some areas than other parts of the country or the national average. But one area in which we are the same as the national average is emissions due to food. And it's very interesting, and what it really illuminated was, and it's not so much local. I mean, there's many reasons to buy local. It's the animal-based food and it's the processed foods that have these huge greenhouse gas emissions. So now we're thinking, well, is there something we can build into our public outreach? That might be our response to something like that. But anyway, I encourage you all to check out that consumption-based inventory. It's really interesting. Wait, one last one in the back.
Sure. Abby, I'm curious. Thank you very much, first off. Absent Governor Brown being the closest thing we have to a benevolent dictator for this type of policy thinking going forward, is there, 2 questions, I guess. One, is there someone in the Bay Area who you could see as an organization that could help convene some of these different key parties, CCAs, the Air District, folks like BayREN, And if there is that person out there, who is it? And who else would you say needs to come to the table besides maybe the organization that just named?
So the question is, in the Bay Area, who could be a person or an entity, organization, would be a good convener, kind of spanning these economic sectors and these different interests on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the Bay Area? And then the second part of that was?
Maybe key parties that you...
Oh, key parties that are not at the table that should be at the table. So the first one, yeah, I'm not sure. It's so vastly complex that it's hard to lump all these sectors together. So right now we're thinking this economic sector approach makes a lot of sense, and to do kind of this, what we're doing, this sector by sector approach. So for energy, BayREN. For agriculture or natural and working lands, we even within that sector, there's the wetlands folks, and then there's like the ranching and grazeland folks. So I don't know that it is more helpful to do it kind of an overall convening, although we will be having a climate summit that the Air District is hosting in October. So stay tuned to that. And then who else needs to be at the table? I think Sigal mentioned a great one, realtors. I think we need to bring more of the business community to the table, and that because some of this, especially with existing buildings, is really going to rely on some innovation, and it may be that we really need to bring the business sector in. That's just my, off the top of my head, comment.
Sorry, Christopher, I would director of BKI consulting group, but I work very closely with BayREN, and we're very interested. There's so many of these forums are opportunities for us to come together, but also so many of us are so busy that these types of the symposiums and the various events like that are great, but it's hard to get action coming out of them. And as you said, Abby, there's a big goal out there.
Yeah.
So, I'm 71 by the time I'll get to 2050, but some of us will be older and younger than that. There's a lot to do.
Yeah, let me just offer that. Jerry Long, I've also visited the MARC, I guess we call it MARC now, the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, which was the Joint Policy Committee, and supposedly brings together some ABAG, Air District, and NBC on some of these climate action issues, and maybe we haven't utilized that well enough.
Yeah, for folks on the webinar, that's Jerry Lahr from ABAG, and mentioned that there is the kind of the central little kind of coordinating group among the 4 regional agencies is the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, and they focus on climate, greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change adaptation, and perhaps we haven't let them or utilized them as a regional convening force as much as we could. That's a good point. Thank you.